Okay, so I'm going to show you how I create waterfalls for feature film matte paintings. So in 3D Studio Max, you can use particle flow. You can create a PF source, and initially the particle flow particle emitter is just going to spew particles out directly out of its emitter. I'm going to create a gravity and a wind force modifier. Obviously the gravity is going to be the arrow pointing downward, and the wind is going to be the one I'm manipulating right now, which is blowing sideways. Okay, I'm going to create a deflector, and this deflector is just going to simulate a large rock in the cliff down below the waterfalls. When the particles are falling downwards after they're affected by gravity, they're not being affected by gravity yet. When they fall downwards, they will bounce off of this deflector, much as they would in real life when a waterfalls sheet downwards and impact and spray off in different directions. So in the particle view, we have the ability to modify what this particle system is doing with these little windows, with these little events. So within the event, we can change its birth, the time at which the particles are starting, its color. I'm going to change them to a red in this case, and their effect by gravity or wind. So within this event 1, I'm going to append a force operator, and within force I'm just going to add by clicking on gravity. So now you can see instantly all the particles start to flow downward. As I press play, they pour out of the emitter and they fall downward. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the deflector and try and move it into position in the side view so that it's in a place where some of the particles, not all of them, will impact it. Now if we go back into the particle view, we can go and append an operator that is a collision spawn. We can select the OmniFlect deflector, and now we can see instantly that all the particles are bouncing off of that deflector. Now they're bouncing off quite dramatically. So we want to reduce the bounce on them. So there's several ways to do that. You can reduce the actual bounce. So back in particle view, I'll add a shape. And so you can add multiple shapes. And what this is allowing me to do is to tell the particles what to do or what to look like, how to act after they reach that collision spawn. So I connected the collision spawn event to this shape event, and I turned the green, I turned the shape event to green, and now you can see the particles turn green after they hit that deflector. I'm going to add a force, add the gravity and wind as I did before, and though they're green inside our viewport, all that is letting me keep track of what's happening to what particles and what particles are doing. You know, I can pay attention to that by color. So if I want to make the green particles a mist and blow off in the wind, I can reduce the wind here to 0.5, so that they react a little differently than our other particles. And I can also go ahead and add another test event, which is spawn. And with spawn, I can add another shape, and this shape might illustrate smaller water particles. Whichever you choose to do, it can be smaller or larger. Bottom line is you just want something different to be happening as these particles interact with collisions or deformers. The more complex the motion, the more complex the interaction of these particles, then the more realistic it can look. So I'll add this other event, force event, to the blue particles, and get the wind to affect them. And reduce the intensity. Right now I'll reduce the intensity to 500, just so that they are reacting a little differently than the green particles. Ultimately I'm going to try and make the blue Omni 1. And then back with the group of the blue particles, you can rename this to whatever you want. Something that makes sense. So we're going to call this one mist particles. So now we have our waterfall in green and our blue mist particles. We can try and adjust their variables accordingly. Tweak the influence of the wind. So if we increase the wind intensity on those blue particles, we can get them to blow over like lighter misty particles would. And then we can change their appearance and size. The size will change their appearance in the render, so I'm going to put them down to 3 just because I know that I want them to look smaller in our render. And then here in a wireframe, we can change them to dots so that they look smaller than the other crosshairs or the ticks that we have in green. So I also decreased the influence of gravity just so that they were swept by the wind a little more. And we'll go back to the green particles and put the wind at 300 so that the green particles flow downwards and blow in the wind less than our blue ones that are mist. And we'll do a test render. We'll see that in our test render we have colors. However, the blue particles aren't showing up too well. So let's go over and we'll change the blue to a yellow. Render it out again, and hopefully we'll be able to see them. They're also not showing up as well because we had the size set to 3, so just for argument's sake we'll put them up to 5 and see if they appear. See, they're there, it's just they are smaller. And later on we'll up the number of particles all around. Here's 20 just to be extreme, to illustrate a point. Later on we'll up the number of particles, and so the yellow bodies will definitely grow in number but not in size, and they'll appear more mist-like. With that collision spawn we'll need another deflector. So I'll just copy a deflector over, and we'll have another little rock shelf where the water particles are going to spray off down below. Again, we're just going to position it kind of like we did last time, halfway in the waterfall. And we'll have to add the deflector, just like we did the other one. Do a little bit of reorganization in the particle view, just so we can see all the names, P-Omniflect 1 and P-Omniflect 2. move the boxes around just so we can see the connection wires, just so it's all readable. So now we see the red particles are bouncing off of the lower deflector. They're not changing color or changing appearance, they're just bouncing because we haven't defined how they should look, move, or appear in any way. So with event 2, we're going to define that. So now they're changing blue. And we're going to set it up much in the same way. We want similar motion, not identical. So we're going to use the same gravity and the same wind. Just always keep in mind that even though you're using those numbers, you can change the impact of them with influence. So you can see that the blue particles, are sliding right off the deflector. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the friction slider, show you how that affects things. So we have friction set to 0. So if we give it a higher percentage of friction, you'll note that as the particles hit that deflector, they will slow down and eventually come sliding off the deflector. But there is a little bit of friction. And the inherent velocity, you can just reduce that because the particles are going to slow down a little bit when they hit that rock. It'll make for a nice look because after they hit that rock, then they'll begin to accelerate once again. And that's what you get in nature when you have water particles hitting the rocks and stuff. They slow down and then they speed up from gravity, and they slow down as they hit other things. So now if we go back up to the original particle flow source, and go back into particle view, we can append a spawn. And if we append a spawn here at this point in our stack, we can connect it to, let's say, the mist. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us some mist particles defined here as yellow dots that come from the very top of the waterfall, not just from the uppermost deflector. So again, we have a very complex system being built here. We have a hierarchy of mist happening in collisions, and overall it's mimicking somewhat what happens in nature. So I'm just going to make the particles a little bit bigger. So the red particles now, they've grown. Just want to make things a little bit more obvious at this point in time. So now if we go in and create a camera, we can start seeing through the camera's eye. And with this particular particle type, with particle flow, if you want to add motion blur to your renderings, which is virtually necessary for a photorealistic look of something like waterfalls, we'll be able to do that within the camera motion blur. So this is what it renders like without motion blur on. Basically just a bunch of dots against black. Just going to reposition the camera, get it a little closer. A bunch of dots, and they're not blurred even though they're moving. Now if I go into the camera settings, I can go into my multipass effect, turn on motion blur, and choose the total number of passes. I'll leave it at a default of 9. I usually up it to about 12. And so 9 will give us 9 render passes, 9 fractions of how much the particles move between frames. And as a result, we get a motion blur. If we zoom in, we can see that's how far the particle is falling within 9 passes. Okay, so let's concentrate on the look of the particles. We're going to add a gray shader. And we're going to take that shader. I'm not going to tweak the shader values very anymore, just because at the scale that we're going to see these waterfalls, we're not going to see much specular or transparency in them. So this is what the particles look like when they're quite large. And I'll shrink them down so that they appear like smaller water droplets. Turn the motion blur off. And with the motion blur off, we'll better see how the particles appear naturally at a size of 10. And of course, as you spawn and have collision events that spawn, basically, your particle numbers can grow really quickly and your render times can slow down. So this is what it looks like with motion blur on. It's starting to come along. Although I think the particle system needs a little bit more chaos. So why don't we move some of these deflectors around. If we try and move them around in a artistic fashion, then we'll get a more designed chaos out of it. Something that hopefully looks a little more like the waterfalls that we took from Yosemite and put in the matte painting. So just to speed up rendering, you can turn the motion blur off. And then as you push and pull these deflectors around, you can render them really quickly and see what you get as a result. What I'm trying to achieve here is I'm going to try and move the deflector up near the top of the source and try and split it in half. So if we rotate this deflector, just get the corner, the bottom corner there, to touch the waterfall, but kind of split it apart like two curtains. We'll see if that works. A lot of playing with particles, especially when you're beginning with particles, is trial and error, just to see what the computer comes up with. So we have a little bit of a split at the very top, but I guess I was picturing something more dramatic. So let's try and scale this a little bit deeper and try and cut through that wall of water a little bit more. That's a little bit better. With motion blur, it might also enhance the look of that split, because where there's water, it'll appear like there's a little more water, and when there's not as much particles, it'll be emphasized because of the lack of motion blur. So on the deformer, I'm just changing its inherent velocity and how it affects the particles, hoping that it'll make a more obvious split. So one thing to keep in mind when you're creating something like waterfalls is to look at footage of waterfalls as much as possible, study how they work. One thing I noticed in looking at waterfalls recently, larger waterfalls that occur in nature, is that there's a pulse that happens. It's as if with every wave that happens on the lake or river above, it pushes in a rhythm the water over the waterfall. And as a result, you get this pulse, you get a push of density and less dense, more dense and less dense particles. So I'm trying to achieve that here. So if you watch this area here, you'll see that you can see that there's a little bit of density change, and it sheets off in a rhythm. That type of thing is achieved by simply animating the speed of particles as they depart from the emitter. You can pulse it much like it would be in nature, faster and faster and slower, with whatever period you want, and just try and get the best result possible. So we're going to call this this one particle system complete, and I'll make several more just like it for the shot.